Song is up, and so we're using. Go ahead and disconnect.
Welcome to Politics Done Right. I am Egberto Willis, your host. Good morning, Houston. How's everybody doing today? I trust everybody's doing fine. Look, folks, we have a great show for you today. The beginning of the show is going to be an interview that I did yesterday with the one and only Thom Hartmann. But before we get started, I'd like to throw back to the studio to say, Senor Howard Reynolds and Senor Jacques Van Beber, how are my favorite peeps doing in the studio?
Well, good morning, Egberto. We're doing just fine. The tin cans and string have held up, and we've actually added a new feature that we'll try out later on. Here is Jack to tell us his thoughts for the day.
Okay, I got a little ditty here. Good morning, Egberto. It's good. It's
Good
good to hear
morning,
your
Jack.
voice. Sorry about yesterday. Uh, Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh, I thought that might be
Prescient.
McCartney with the Beatles. Yeah.
But wait a minute. It's funny because I hadn't heard that, and as Jack was saying that, I'm like, hey, Jack, good one, man, good one, because Jack has a way with words. When we sit down and talk, sometimes he come out and he'll say certain things, and it's like, oh yeah, that's true. That's true. Anyway, thanks for those words of wisdoms from El Senor MLK. Anyhow, folks, we got a great show today. The title of the show is Thom Hartmann visits to talk democracy. Asset managers, second topic, asset managers invest big in nuclear and cluster bombs. Thom Hartmann discussed his new book, The Hidden History of American Democracy, in terms of today's struggling democracy. I love the book. What I love most of all, folks, is the following. A lot of times we have a lot of folks who write books, but in the book themselves, as they complain, and I'm not talking about novels, I'm talking about books of talking about real history or not fantasy, real things, right? I wrote a book called "As I See It: Class Warfare: The Only Resort to Right-Wing Doom," in which I was hard on the economic system, etc., and these other issues. But the one thing I tried to do is to make sure that you don't just complain. You don't just try to make it seem like somebody else is at fault. You do two things, and that is you talk about solutions and you talk about the personal responsibility that you have to work towards solutions. A lot of folks like to sit back and just and complain. Don't do that. I believe in we are the solution. So if you remember from yesterday's show, I started to mention quite a few things as saying, nope, I think I was talking to Tag at the time, one of our regular callers. And when Tag sort of said, I kind of throw the hands up in the air. I said, no, 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 no. What we do is we can actually make the change because you know what? In as much as we have democracy problems, as Thom Hartmann's going to talk about, we have control still. We still have control, and we still have the tentacles of democracy within us. But without further ado, and without me doing all this talking, let's go ahead and listen to El Senor Thom Hartmann. Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto Willis, your host. Today, we are honored once again to speak to the one and only Thom Hartmann, the progressive radio host. I call it progressive radio host extraordinaire. Thom Hartmann is a four-time winner of the Project Censored Award, a New York Times bestselling author of more than 33 books. How much is it up to right now?
I don't know.
So, all right.
35, 36, I don't know.
I just wanted to break in with that. Anyway, he's America's #1 progressive talk show host. His show is syndicated on local for-profit and non-profit stations and broadcast nationwide and worldwide, including at our station here, KPFT 90.1 FM Houston. It is also simulcast on Holmes, www.hiddenhistorybooks.com. Anyway, today we are here to discuss quite a bit, but Thom, welcome to Politics Done Right again.
Hey, Egberto, it's great to be back with you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, let me tell you, what we are here to discuss again another one of your impressive books. not been able to read it word for word, but just the table of contents and otherwise tells us that it's yet another misread. It covers a lot of things, folks, that we've covered right through this entire program with regards to our democracy, and it's called The Hidden History of American Democracy, in which Thom covered quite a bit. That it is apropos in these times, especially with what we hope Donald Trump, the American traitor, hopefully going to jail. Anyhow, Senor, how are you doing today? Why did you write this book? And I know it's a silly question, but our audience wants to know.
No, it's a great question. I wrote the book because there are so many misconceptions, many of which are being promoted or exploited by right wingers about the foundation of this country. Right wingers saying we're a Christian nation. We're not. That the founders wanted it to be a Christian nation. They didn't. That democracy is an abnormal thing, they say, and it's just an idea somebody came up with. And really, we can kind of set it aside and just make Donald Trump emperor and everything will be fine. That's more normal. 1,000 years of history in Europe. That's not true. Democracy is actually our default state. The theory that the Constitution was written exclusively for rich white men to protect their wealth, an idea that rich white men love to promote, but it's not true. There's a bunch of myths bubbles that I wanted to burst, as it were, myths that I wanted to pop with this book, and I think I hope I've done a good job of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I went through it and it was like, wow, he touches on everything. First of all, let me tell you, the David Cobb, a friend of mine, I think a friend of just about everybody in the progressive space, and who ran once for president of the United States. Once we had a long night discussion. He said the Constitution is nothing more than a capital document. I want to start there. Is that something that you could agree with?
Well, if you define capital as private property, yeah, the Constitution does acknowledge, private property and protect it in some ways. But back in the 1920s, in 1929, actually, Charles Beard and Mary Beard, his wife, they were professors of history at Columbia University. He was a Marxist, he was a socialist. She was a Marxist. And they published what was probably the best-selling American history during that period from the 1930s to the 1950s, called, The History of the United States, from a Marxist economic analysis point of view. Beard also wrote a book called An Economic Analysis of the Constitution, making that argument. And in 1956, Forrest McDonald, a historian and scholar, decided that he would see, was there any truth to this? Going back to, what was the intent of the people who wrote it? Who were the people who wrote it? And what was the intent of the people who ratified the Constitution? And what he found was that, first off, the wealthiest of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, there were a number of people who owned a lot of land. Jefferson and Washington, for example, but land was cheap then. You just stole it from the Indians. And it really wasn't a measure of wealth. In fact, in many ways, it was a kind of a ball and chain. You had to work the land, and there were obligations, and in some cases, even taxes. Jefferson died in bankruptcy. George Washington could not afford to free the slaves that he had promised to free on his death. His estate was gone within a generation. James Madison, his family could only hold on to his estate for about a couple of decades after his death. None of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence left any multi-generational wealth of consequence, and none of them left multi-generational wealth that lasted more than 2 generations. There were no Rockefellers, there were no DuPonts or Morgans or like that among the founders. There were people of that kind of wealth during the founding generation. The Johnson family up on the Hudson River had a massive castle with 300 European retainers who wore knights' suits of armor and things. There were some just obscenely rich people in the United States. Virtually all of them got their wealth from their connections to either the British royal family or the East India Company. And all of them pretty much left the country during the Revolutionary War. The Johnson family fled to Canada, for example. So the wealthiest of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence was John Hancock, and his wealth in today's dollars was around $700,000. He was, so what? First off, what we're talking about is the upper middle class, not the morbidly rich of the era. That was the Declaration. You look at the Constitution. The people who helped write the Constitution, there were no genuinely rich people among that crowd. There were a lot of lawyers. There were a lot of school teachers. Politicians. They were not particularly wealthy. James Madison promised everybody that he would keep their deliberations secret for 50 years until everyone had died, and he kept that promise. They weren't published until after his death, 50 years later. He was very young at the time. He was in his late 20s, early 30s. And the reason why, it turns out, is because they were betraying their class. They were betraying or in their opinions, they were betraying the wealthy people. So McDonald then went and looked at the...
Let's get to stop a second, Tom, because you just enlightened me with something that I didn't know. Because there were many times that I said some stark things about the founding fathers, but you're telling me that in as much as many of the founding fathers were really benevolent guys willing to go against their elitist class. Is that what did I understand that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure benevolent is, it might be a little too gushy, but yeah, they believed in democracy. They believed in this experiment. They practiced it in a very imperfect fashion, and they came from a rather bizarre time and that they were born into. And, I'm not here to justify, for example, slavery, which was the major sin of the era. But yes, and they were not the morbidly rich, and they weren't trying to create a country of, by, and for the morbidly rich. So then McDonald went and looked at the 13 ratifying conventions. Who showed up to ratify the Constitution in each one of these states in 1789. And what he found again was that the genuinely rich people in each one of the states opposed the Constitution. Patrick Henry is a great example. He was the richest man in Virginia. He was the largest slaveholder in Virginia. He held over 360 people in bondage. And he opposed the Constitution. At the ratifying convention, he stood up and spoke against it. In fact, James Madison modified the Second Amendment. I think you and I have talked about this when my book on guns came out.
Right.
Just to satisfy Patrick Henry's paranoia that a president might call up the Virginia militia, which was also their slave patrol, and thus, break the hold of slavery in the state. He changed the word nation to the word state in the Second Amendment. So, yeah, and what Forrest McDonald found was that in every single one of the 13 states, and I've got the information in my book, but you can also read his book. It was published in 1956. It's not in print any longer, but you can find used copies fairly easily. He found that in state after state, the people who were in favor of the Constitution were the people who were in debt, teachers, lawyers, which was not a well-paid profession in most cases, small subsistence farmers, and the people who opposed the Constitution were the genuinely wealthy people, particularly the industrialist class, which was just beginning to emerge, and people who had long associations with the British royal family and the East India Company. So, that's the history. I mean, you can look it up. It's bizarre how it gets danced around. I mean, I think I might have mentioned on Wikipedia, it says, George Washington's estate was worth $1 billion. He was a rich man in his time. And I'm like, no, it wasn't. I mean, he couldn't afford to free his own slaves. Land was cheap. So good.
It is important for us to know that, because, like I said, you come to the wrong conclusions about our democracy, and these folks that are running around with Trump right now. It's amazing how wrong they have it, from us being founded on the Christian nation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you have a chapter in the book called "Did Rich White Guys Create the United States Just to Guarantee Their Own Privilege, Power, and Slaves?" Yeah,
that's what you and I were just talking about. That
right. So I think, in effect, you. And again, that is something that I think many progressives themselves would be out there. Not only conservatives would deny that, but progressives were out there talking a whole lot about that. Now, in this particular group of chapters, you talk about the way the country was structured democratically. Your thoughts on that? Because in all the studying that I've done and the reading of the Constitution, I find it a very flawed document. Personally, I'm no scholar, but I find it a very flawed document that I think all the compromises that were made actually made it not a democracy? Your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, keep in mind, they were trying something that had never before been done. The Roman Republic bore very little resemblance to us. I mean, they had an institution called the Senate. That's about it. The Greek democracy was organized in a completely different fashion. I mean, you had basically jury duty. Everybody had to serve for a year, 6,001 people to create a consensus, or to create I forget the name of the body, the Greek body. So this was a brand new experiment, and it was based largely on the Iroquois Confederacy, frankly, and I document that in some detail in the book. And they were trying to adapt that to a society that was not Iroquois, that was not a hunting gathering society or a marginally agricultural society. And there were a lot of compromises, admittedly. But, the point of democracy, I think the biggest point about democracy that I make in the book, and the biggest myth about democracy, particularly that gets promoted by conservatives, is that democracy is this weird thing that some smart people came up with, but it's not normal for humans. What's normal is the way Europe was for 1,000 years, where you got a king and you got the barons and then you got all the serfs, and that's what's normal. And that's really, what, if left to our own devices, we would recreate, because that's normal for humanity. And it turns out that's complete BS. And not just for humans, by the way. Back about a decade and a half ago, two British scientists, Roper and Conrad, proposed in an article in Nature that we would find that this mythology of the alpha animal in nature, that there's an alpha wolf and an alpha deer and an alpha elk, and that the alpha animal rules the herd, that would be completely false. That what we would find was that the alpha animal would have first selection of sexual partner, of mates, which comports with natural selection to pass along strongest genes. But that would be it. They would not be the decision makers. And James Randerson and a group of scientists put this to the test with a herd of red deer in the forest that was owned by a university at Essex in the UK, putting cameras in the trees and asking the question, when do the deer decide to go to which one of the three watering holes in this forest, and how do they make that decision? And it turned out that the deer would be grazing, and they would start pointing their bodies at one of the three watering holes, different deer. And when 51% of them were pointing at one of the water holes, the entire herd would kind of form and head to that watering hole. Democracy. Wow. So, in our Constitution, not only is it 50% plus one to pass laws and things like that, but for really difficult things like amending the Constitution, dangerous things, we require a supermajority. So what Randerson and his scientists did was they staked a predator near each one of the three watering holes and said, okay, now let's see what the deer do, And then what it took was 66% of the deer pointing at a particular watering hole to head to that watering hole. So that supermajority exists in nature as well. So I called up Ken Conrad and I said, what happened when you published this in Nature? And he was like, oh, I got all this feedback. This bug guy called me up and said, with gnats, ball of gnats in the air, like in the summer, and you see this ball of gnats and then it goes zoop, right, zoop, like that. And how do they know when to move, right? Are they telepathic? No. With every wing beat, every gnat is voting. I'm going to move a little more to the left. And when 51% of them move a little more to the left, the whole ball moves to the left. He heard from a fish guy, and a ichthyologist. Yeah, this accounts for schooling behavior. Again, I always thought fish must be telepathic because there's not a lead fish going, hey, let's go to the right. I mean, at least with geese, they're honking at each other. You think maybe they're talking.
Right.
But, not fish. Well, it turns out they're not telepathic. Every motion is a vote. The same with birds flying and flocking. You'll see a flock of crows going across the sky, and suddenly they just go, yeah, like that. Well, how do they know to do that? Well, they're literally voting with every wing beat. And the conclusion that they came to in this study that ultimately was also published in Nature was that democracy is the default mode in all animals. I mean, from ants to primates. And the founders were particularly fond of this idea. They actually believed this to be the case, so much so that when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he wrote, he was talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he said this was the goal of nature's God. He talks about nature's God in the Declaration.
Right.
And he hands this off to John Adams to edit. And John Adams, of course, was a Christian. John Adams scratches out nature's God and puts in the Christian God, right? And Jefferson gets it back and scratches out the Christian God and writes nature's God. And it's still there in the Declaration of Independence, nature's God. They believed that the natural state was small d democratic. And the goal was to have as much democracy as possible, which is why the first among equals, and they're not really equals, but the first among the three branches of the government, the first among the four parts of the three branches
People's
of the government
House
was the House of Representatives, because it's the closest to people. The Senate then came out of a compromise, the big state, small state compromise. The presidency, the Electoral College, we can talk about that if you want. It's in the book, Why the Electoral College, but that was designed to try to avoid a president who was a scam artist, a hustler, a drunk, a person of low moral character, to quote Alexander Hamilton. And
but the opposite, it turned out the opposite is what occurred, right?
Yeah, sadly. And then the Electoral College became an anachronism within 50 years of its creation because of the telegraph. And because of the Pony Express and things. But when they wrote the Constitution, the problem was, not only was there no telegraph, Ben Franklin was flying kites in thunderstorms. They didn't even have electricity. It was Leyden jar, and that was it. And so it could take 2, 3, and we didn't have a really comprehensive postal system at all. And so it could take 2, 3 weeks. It could take a month for a letter to make it from Georgia to Washington, D.C.
Right.
So how would a voter in Georgia know who to vote for president? There were no national newspapers. There was no telegraph. There's no radio or television. So what they came up with was that the Georgians would not vote for president. They would vote for people who were pledged to particular candidates for president, but they were actually voting for these electors. And the electors would then go physically to Washington, D.C., where on December 15th, they would cast their votes. And physically being in D.C., they would interview the candidates. And if they concluded that the people of Georgia had voted for a guy who was really a scoundrel, they wouldn't cast their vote for him, which is why you have, faithless electors. They literally wrote that in the Constitution. It was a great kind of safety valve protection system against a Donald Trump kind of person. But like I said, by the time the Pony Express and the telegraph came along, in the 1830s and 1840s, it was completely anachronistic. It was completely out of date. And we should have gotten rid of it 150 years ago. We almost did, by the way. We came within one vote in the Senate of getting rid of the Electoral College in the 1970s. In the 1970s. It was 74.
Okay.
I didn't have to go back and look.
It needs to go because, in as much as they did it for good purposes, in my opinion, again, it was never a real fail-safe, fail-safe. And look at what we've had. Every time that it misfired, for a particular kind of person. It's amazing.
George W. Bush and Donald Trump. Bush lost by half million.
Same kind of vote, right?
3 million. Yeah. So it's time to get rid of the Electoral College.
But I'm glad to hear that Nate. I speak a lot about most people being good. And in as much as most people being good, we just have these charlatanes out here that like Donald Trump and others. But my question then about democracy, and I want to go into something great about your book, is that a lot of times you write these books and it tells you about all the different problems that you have. What I like about your book is at the end of the book, you have an itemized list of solutions that we have to work towards if we want to maintain our democracy. But before we get there, I'd like to ask about how do we handle the mindset of people? Because that animals, which we are inherently democratic, but that we have allowed an autocratic streak because of being ill-informed and brainwashed. Mm-hmm. I guess animals don't get brainwashed because they don't have our intellect. How can we mitigate that, in your opinion? Because that is my task, your task, and the task of many doing this kind of work.
Well, and that was the founding generation's task, too. I mean, Jefferson repeatedly wrote, I do not trust the rich to protect this nation. I mean, he said that a half a dozen different ways at different times. And not only him, I mean, multiple founders trash talked the morbidly rich of their time. It's a real challenge. I mean, we've seen Jefferson identified three groups that were oppressive in the history of Europe, and that was warlords, people who conquered by force of violence, theocrats, popes typically, and the morbidly rich, the lords, the barons, and their goal in creating this document was to have the power derived, as the Declaration says, derived from the consent of the governed. And so, with all of my solutions in the end of the book, they're all put in the context of, if the goal of American democracy, of our American republic, is to have something close to a democracy, the essence of a democracy is that what the majority of people want is what they get. And so if you look at, I mean, I don't think there's a single thing in my solutions chapter that doesn't poll well over 50%. And yet we don't have them for this reason that you just identified, which is we've been conquered. We've been conquered by the morbidly rich. And it really started in 1971. I mean, it has happened a couple of times in our history. The morbidly rich rose up in the 1830s. I think you and I talked about this when my book about American oligarchy came out.
Right.
The cotton gin and how that contributed to fewer than 2,000 families ending up completely controlling all the politics and economics of the South. And, we fought a civil war over that. Then you had the rise of the robber barons again in the 1880s, 1890s. And then there was, Teddy Roosevelt and the trust buster going after them. And then you had the morbidly rich rising again in the 1920s and leading to the Republican Great Depression. And then Franklin Roosevelt went after them. So by 71, the rich people had by and large excluded themselves from politics. And that's when Lewis Powell came along and said, if rich people and corporations don't get involved in politics, we're going to find ourselves on the outside looking in, because Ralph Nader is really popular and he's a communist, essentially. And he called him out. He calls out Ralph Nader in the Powell memo. That was in 71. In 72, Richard Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. In 76, he voted on the Buckley decision, which said that bribing politicians shall no longer be called bribery because money is not money, it's speech, right? And in 78, he actually wrote the decision in the Buckley versus First National Bank, or the Bellotti versus First National Bank decision, or First National Bank versus Frank Bellotti, in which he said that not only is money free speech, but that corporations are persons and they're entitled to use free speech this way.
That was a killer. Oh, yeah.
And it was, and that the result of that was just a tsunami of mostly oil industry money flowing into the Republican Party and floating Ronald Reagan into the White House, as in reaction to Jimmy Carter creating a solar bank that would have had 20% of the nation's electricity being generated by the year 2000. Carter put that into place in 79, I think it was. And
he actually put the panels on the roof of the White House that Reagan summarily removed as soon as he got there.
That's right. That's right. And so, this was the beginning. There's another kind of backstory to it that I don't think is in this book. I think it's in my book on oligarchy. But in 1951, Russell Kirk wrote a book called The Conservative Mind, in which he argued that the American middle class was growing very rapidly. It was closing in on 50% of Americans at that time in 1951. It was in the mid 40s. And he said, if it ever reaches, there's some kind of a threshold here, probably well over 50%, where if the American middle class reaches that threshold, it will throw America into social chaos, because people who have never had money don't know how to handle money. People who have never had political power don't know how to handle political power. This is essentially the same argument that the Dixiecrats made about giving political power to Black people in the South, that it would be a dangerous, dangerous thing to do. And Kirk was considered a crackpot by most Republicans in 1951 when he published this book. William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater thought he was a genius, but that was about it. But then came the 60s. In 61, the birth control pill was legalized, and within 3 years was widespread. And boom, you had the women's movement. You had the civil rights movement was growing like a weed in the 60s. In 64, you got the Civil Rights Act, 65, the Voting Rights Act. Martin Luther King and all of the various parts of the Black movement, the civil rights movement, and then you also had the war in Vietnam, and you had young men saying, "Hell no, I'm not going to go," which was exactly what Russell Kirk had predicted: that women would no longer know their place, that minorities would no longer know their place, and that even the children of the white upper class would start to rebel. And that's literally what happened in the 60s, what he predicted in 1951. Now, it didn't happen for the reasons that he predicted, that there was too big a class. It happened for, exogenous reasons, other, external reasons, like, the development of the birth control pill. But it happened. And so in the 70s, that's why Lewis Powell wrote the Powell Memo. And that's why the mandate that Reagan had when he came into office in 1981 was to cut the middle class down to size. And when he came into office, the middle class was 2/3 of us. 1/3 of America had a good union job, which set the wage and benefit floor locally, so that 2/3 of Americans had the equivalent of a good union job and had a middle class where one wage earner could buy a home, buy a new car every 2 years, take a vacation every year, and have enough money left over for retirement and to put their kids through school. That was my family. That was my dad. He worked in a tool and die shop, and that was the life he had. Although he didn't put me through school, but that was the middle class. So Reagan set out to destroy the middle class to save America. And these guys really believed that they were saving America.
You know what, Tom? I think you give them a lot of credit. I wonder if they really want to save America. As one of the things that I say, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, because my contention is that they don't want a strong middle class. They don't want an educated people, because an educated people would ask about our economic system. Why would we work so hard for so little to ensure that so many get so much? In effect, they are all on our backs.
Yeah, that's the essence of the union movement. And that's what built the American middle class. And that's why when Reagan set out to destroy the middle class, the first thing he attacked was the union movement. And we went from 1/3 of Americans being unionized when he came into office to, by the time the Reagan-Bush 12 years was over, down to about 10%. I think we're around 6 or 8% in the private workforce now in the union movement. Crazy. So I think your analysis is right, but I don't think that they were sitting around saying, people will start questioning, like having Marxist analysis, economic analysis of power. No, they just didn't want people to have unions. They didn't want to have to pay people well. It was much simpler than that. But, a lot of among the theoreticians, the Buckleys and the Goldwaters, I really, having read their work and having, been steeped in their work when I was a kid, I really believe that they thought they were doing the best thing. I don't think that by the end of his term, Reagan thought he was doing the right thing, or the people around him. I think they just thought they were dancing to the tune of the really rich, who now own.
Are you saying you thought Reagan didn't think he was doing a bad thing? You think Reagan really thought he was saving the country?
I think he thought that at the beginning. I don't think, by the end, he was full-blown dementia, so who knows? But
yeah, right,
I don't think George Herbert Walker Bush thought that. I think he thought he was making America safe for aristocracy, because he was a member of the aristocratic class. His grandfather was the senator and the wealthy banker and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Anyhow, we don't have a lot of time here. So what I'm going to ask you to do, Tom, is if you can, you have a whole lot of solutions. And I think that's what this is all about, guys, the solutions that are here in the book. Why don't you give me your 3 tops?
Well, again, these are things that the majority of Americans want. And the only reason we don't have them is because the Supreme Court has legalized political bribery. So, I'd say to begin with, everybody in America should have health care. It should be part of the commons, and it should be administered by the government, or at least paid for by the government, single payer like Canada does. And it would cost half as much. And you wouldn't have, people like Dollar Bill McGuire, the guy who started, United Healthcare, who walked away with $1.4 billion. That's obscene. Every penny of that was taken from somebody, from saying to somebody, no, we won't pay for your liver transplant.
Exactly.
So number 1, healthcare. Number 2, education. What we learned from the GI Bill, which my dad went to college on. He only went for 2 years. My wife's dad went all the way through law school and ended up the assistant attorney general for the state of Michigan. And he came from a dirt poor, like literally no running water family. Is that the education is an investment. What we learned from the GI Bill was that for every dollar that the federal government invested in educating young people coming back from World War II, mostly young men, but nonetheless young people, was that we got $7 of return on investment in additional tax revenue, because educated people earn more and they stimulate the economy. And there is no way that education is an expense; it's an investment, and that's why we are literally the only country on Earth, or developed country on Earth, where there's a student debt crisis. Every other country subsidizes higher education, like we did until 1980. Or until the 1980s. I mean, Reagan ended free college in California as governor in the 70s, and then when he came into the White House, he cut. One of his first cuts was a 25%, 25% across the board cut to federal education support, and that began the gutting of the American public education system. So number two would be public education. I'd say number three, and it's a very vital one, is establishing an absolute right to vote, so that Republican governors can no longer purge you from the voting rolls. They can no longer make you stand in line for 12 hours. They can no longer make you jump through 16 different hoops. You automatically get registered as soon as you turn 18, like in every other democratic country in the world. We have these bizarre systems that are purely the result of rich people having been given the power to own politicians by a corrupt Supreme Court. So those are my top three.
The name of the book, The Hidden History of American Democracy. Read this, and I love the subtitle, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. Rediscovering American Ancient Way of Living. From the New York Times best-selling author, Thom Hartmann. Thank you so kindly once again, Thom. I revere your work. Thank you so kindly for being once again on Politics Done Right.
Thank you so much, Egberto, for inviting me. It's so nice talking with you. I appreciate it.
All right, folks, that was Thom Hartmann on his new book on democracy. And it's, I think, apropos, especially for these times. You wonder sometimes, again, you get the genesis of the country, how the country started, and the things that we've gone through. How could we possibly be here? I don't want to say again, because the truth is we've never been here. But how can we be here? How can we have a country right now that's that's teetering on fascism? And that's not hyperbole at all. A country that is teetering on fascism. Anyhow, folks, the telephone number is 713-526-5738. All lines are open. I'd love to hear your thoughts. 713-526-5738. Love to hear what you thought about the topic that was covered by Thom Hartmann. What you think about these issues? I want to see those lines filled up. 713-526-5738. I have another topic. Do remember, you can always go to politicsdoneright.com/newsletter to see all of the topics that we cover on every show, whether we get to the topic or not. That is 713-526-5738. Very important, 713-526-5738. I'm going to be going to the lines right now. We have one call so far, but please go ahead and give us a call. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So let's go to Anonymous and move on from there. Anonymous, how are you doing this morning?
Hello. So was he promoting the Powell memo? Is that what I heard?
Oh, no. He wasn't promoting the Powell memo. He was pointing out the fact that the Powell memo is directly responsible for a lot of our anti-democratic the anti-democratic things that are occurring in our society at this point. I don't know if you're a listener of our show regularly, but we have several blogs we've written on the Powell memo and how it's destroyed the minds of many or schools, etc., with the things that it promotes. Go ahead, Anonymous.
Have you heard about the Clarity anniversary this year, 1923? This guy from Europe named Clarity wrote a plan to invade Europe with Central Asia folks, like we call it the Middle East these days, I think. And we are over here, talking about a lot of stuff, but it's like China has pretty much taken over all the trade bloc in Euro-Asia and most of the world. We only have a couple of countries that we are actually, I think it's like parts of Europe, EU, I think, and a couple. So I'm wondering if we have all this going on around the world and they're moving on, and over here we're focused on, like those guys are Trotskyites. Crystal, all those guys in the 50s, the neocons, Leo Strauss. I mean, they're a created opposition to Communist Manifesto from Leon Trotsky. So I mean, those guys had their time, and I think that's why we're still sort of screwed, because our policies. But Powell, that was really bad, because when they passed that memo, Kissinger tapped this guy named Klaus Schwab on the shoulder in '72, and the rest is history. That's 50 years of compromising our Constitution with outside business lobbying. So, I mean, we really have a detrimental type of situation going on, and Europe being taken down after the century anniversary of Kalergi. I think you know who he is. So, I mean, there's a lot going on, and we're still pointing fingers here at home.
The finger pointing serves. I was trying to listen to you to get what the gist of your discussion is. But hold 1 quick second. Folks, give us a call at 713-526-5738. The lines are wide open, 713-526-5738. Hit extension 2 and we'll get you on air right away. Yeah, Anonymous, here is the deal. We have a lot of problems. I want to address two things that you said. Once you talk about what China is doing as I don't know in what context you're talking about China, good or bad, but I tell you say that again? Right. Let me tell you economically.
It's bad, just a fact. It's just, there's no bias here. There's no opinion.
Okay, good. I'm glad that you said that. I am glad that you said no opinion here, because let me just give you some contrast here. And this has nothing to do with opinion. China is all over the world, benevolent or not. China is all over the world, and the kinds of things that it's doing in countries from Jamaica to Argentina to Costa Rica to Panama to many of the countries in Africa right now, is it's using its financial power on building things. So far, what we've done in the last since the neocons have taken full hold of America, is we have been bombing things. I want you to realize that whenever we talk about doing things, you don't see us doing a whole lot of investments that build up people around the world. I want you to really ask yourself, I can go to any one of these countries that I mentioned, and you'll see a big stamp that says these roads being built in collaboration, like the new freeway that was built in Jamaica, in collaboration with China, the new roads that were built in Nairobi, in collaboration with China. How do you get friends? How do you get people to like you? Whether you're doing it for benevolent reasons or not, you don't do it with...
I think it's just business. I think it's just business, meaning...
No, but let me finish, and let me finish. I think I made you talk, but let me just finish, because it's an important statement here. When you talk about we stay here in the United States pointing fingers, you're absolutely right. That is what our media, that is what many of us have allowed ourselves to devolve into. And in the process, it was done on purpose, because we ask, why is it that we are blowing up a whole lot of things while China is building a whole lot of things? Because the people who run our government makes a profit from the military-industrial complex, from the oil-industrial complex.
I appreciate you going through this, the exercise of what we do, but what I'm trying to say is, if the same folks that finance Western mercantilism, the Americas, and basically stood up this, Brave New World, or what you want to call it, this republic, this beacon, this bastion, and it's used to finally foreclose all resistance. All central banks are deployed. At the same time, concurrently, using the century of shame, suppressing China with the heroin, the bassoon out of Turkey around, they stood them up. We installed Mao, Chiang Kai-shek, and now we're going into a new chapter. And it's really neat to see how they stood us up temporary. Bretton Woods.
Okay.
And the next 22nd, it's going to be pretty big with that announcement of Brits SDR. IMF sponsored that. IMF is allowing the yuan being used to pay back all Argentina's debt, all Afghanistan. It's really going on right now. A lot of stuff's blowing going, and here we are.
All right. Mm-hmm.
Mafia. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, look, thank you very much for calling, my friend. I understand what you're saying. And by the way, I think I recognize your voice as other than anonymous, but I won't mention it in case I make a mistake.
Don't have to say.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
All right. All right. You have a great day. All right. Let's see. Anyway, folks, the next topic is U.S. asset managers have significant investments in nuclear weapons and cluster bombs. But before I go to that, I think I better go to Mike, who just called in. Let's come on to the air, Mike. Mike, you're on. All right. I think Mike.
Well, we're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Now
Come on
I
in.
think we can get. There. Where's Mike?
All right.
Yeah.
Here I am. Got me?
Yes, I got you, Mike.
All right. About the China dominance. Their corporations pay, or at least partly owned by their government. So their government is getting the right of getting money that corporations should be contributing to our treasury. So they're benefiting from their way of running their government. You can call it communism, you can call it whatever you want. I call it survival, because if you're benefiting from the labor force, you should contribute to the treasury that the labor force contributes to also. Look at the comparison. Corporations here, they don't contribute their fair share. Look at what all we're lacking. Education is pitiful. Health care is non-existent for the masses. And they want to cut everything. And they want the middle class and those that are working to subsidize the portions or the percentages of the taxes that should be paid by corporations. So you can complain about China. China is in survival mode, dominating mode, and they're exhibiting it around the world. What's your opinion?
First of all, how am I going to disagree with a factual statement? I can't disagree with a factual statement. The fact of the matter is, in America, corporations and the wealthy build all of that on the backs of everybody else. That is not even something that one should discuss. That's why we use a whole lot of smoke and mirrors here, right? Because let me ask you this. Let's think about somebody who has $1 billion. What could they have provided to society to have extracted 1 billion worth of capital out of society? That one human being couldn't possibly work for that. What that means is that we have an economic system that has created a mechanism for one person to be able to use everybody else to enrich themselves. It's an economic system. And what we've learned from the beginning of our lives in America is that somehow that is fair, because if you have an idea, you should be able to make money on that idea unlimitedly, even though that idea had to be implemented by hundreds of people, thousands of people, millions of people. I always use Bill Gates as an example because I think of Bill Gates as a good guy. In other words, Bill Gates is a good guy who became a multi-billionaire in a flawed economic system. What do I mean by that? Bill Gates did not invent much, right? When Bill Gates started, IBM was looking for an operating system for a new computer they didn't know would be a success. And in so doing, Bill Gates, because of his position, because of his contacts, he went ahead and said, wait a minute, I know this guy in Seattle who has a kind of a operating system built already. I'll pen this system to IBM, not sell it to IBM, license it, and in the process make billions as I expanded on that with other people's intellect. But he was the one who made billions, and a few of his cohorts were the ones who made billions. But the ones who created all of this were hundreds of thousands of us. And we feel it's okay for that guy to have a good guy because he's giving it all away. And I would, if he wasn't giving it away, I would be even more upset. But again, it wasn't really his. The problem I have with billionaires is that we have given them an undemocratic way to redistribute money, which is not a fair economic system. So breaking that right back down to you, Mike, which I said, how can I disagree with a factual statement? The corporations are built on the back of all of us, and there's nothing specifically intellectual about them that make them better than many of the folks that are working for them right now. And you say, Mike?
I say you're right, because that one individual is not contributing to the success of the company. It's taking off cooperative of all those employees. But we have laws that are written to benefit those individuals from paying their fair share. So I'm back to making it personal. You have to get involved, like Tom would say. Politics is not a spectator sport. You got to get involved, just like President Obama. You got to get involved. You can't sit around and complain. It's time to go to work. If you don't see the changes that's not benefiting us, I don't know what to tell you, because you're not paying attention in class. I call life a class. You attend class every day, and you better be paying attention.
I think I just think you spoke the right word, if you will, because you have to get engaged, and if you don't get engaged, then we aren't able to move forward. But anything else you'd like to add, Mike, before we go on to the next subject, or if somebody else call 713-526-5738, extension numero dos, extension number 2, 713-526-5738. Go ahead.
Thanks for the conversation. Have a good day.
You have a wonderful day, my friend.
6 minutes.
Go ahead, Senor Reynolds.
Oh, I was just testing out the intercom system, so I didn't have to get on the air. I'll tell you that you got 3 seconds left.
Yeah, you're on the air.
No,
Well,
I wasn't.
Well, let me tell you what just happened there. I'm talking to Howard, right? I'm trying to pull your name out of the air when this guy Mike was talking, and I'm like, you're speaking. I was about to call you Harold, Howard. I don't know what happened at this time of the morning. Maybe it's that I need to get.
People have made that same error. I've been called Harold so many times. It's unbelievable. Maybe they should have named me Harold.
There we go. But folks, 713-526-5738. Will you be the third caller? 713-526-5738. You can be on air right away. I can either talk about what we've been talking about, or we can go ahead and speak on the other issue. But here comes the calls. 713-526-5738. I love what Mike had to say, because what I'm trying to build into all of us here, right, is the power that we have, not implied, but that we actually have, and that I want us to use. So let's go to Brian. Come on in, Brian.
Yeah, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I'd like to talk about the last caller, about communism and
Yes, sir.
economic system is in China.
Yes.
Any idea what the Belt and Road system is? Would you
Yes.
explain this to me?
Yeah. What do you mean? The roads that they go build around the world, and the financing that goes with it?
Yeah, that Belt and Road. What do you think that initiative is for?
Influence.
Self-determination?
No, influence.
No,
Influence.
that's world domination. No, it's world domination. Do you know Xi Jinping? Do you know
I
his
don't-
personality?
Look, I don't think you do either.
From Beijing, China.
Brian.
Really? My wife
Brian?
is from China. I know
Brian,
very well communist
let me just,
system.
I understand, sir. Let me just say one thing here, okay? When China build roads and so forth, notice when I spoke to Mike, I wanted to have nothing to do with what's the benevolence or otherwise of what China is doing. All I'm saying is what China is doing around the world is different than what we're doing. When we influence other parts of the world, we are doing nothing different than what China is doing. We want to have influence on that world. When you talk about how bad Xi Jinping is and how he treats people or whatever, I always say let's look in the mirror. So let's be clear here, my friend Brian. You are a good person. I am a good person. Now, when we talk about governments, we don't talk about good and bad. We talk about what the corporations within these governments and the structures do. I don't fall in love with presidents and Xi Jinping or Bush or anybody else. I just look at what's being done and who is being helped.
Verba, who is going to attack a sovereign nation? Xi Jinping on Taiwan, correct?
Well, wait, we attacked a sovereign nation. We attacked Panama from the United States and killed 10,000 Panamanians. Sir, it is important. I am from Panama. I am from Panama. What I'm trying to tell you, Brian, is let's be careful. Brian, sir, I am from Panama. I'm telling you the history. And I'm telling you from the history and the inception of how...
I was the pre-invasion for it.
No, sir. The history of Panama doesn't... Sir, please hold. The history of Panama does not start with the invasion. It was how the country was created. We wanted to build a canal. Colombia said no. We said we'll use power to take it. I'm saying let's be careful how we point fingers and reason.
The Panama Canal, not the United States,
No,
not Colombia.
Sir, again, Colombia denied the United States the right to do it, and the United States said no one can do that. We will take sovereign land, and we did it.
The French started the Panama Canal. Started the Panama Canal.
Sir, I'm giving you the history. You can either accept it or not. I'm telling you, everybody knows a canal was tried by by the French in Colombia, okay? Panama was Colombia. And the United States created Panama out of Colombia, but we are out of time. I'm so sorry. Look, call back Brian. Let's talk about this tomorrow. Yeah, thank you, sir. Anyway, my name is Egberto Willies. We're out of time. This is Politics Done Right. And you guys know how I end this, baby. Callers, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We'll get you the next time. I am what? Out.